Hello, ladies and gents. We are continuing on looking at dataset creation. And in the first video, we talked about how to actually set up your dataset. So we talked about protecting the data, make sure that you make multiple copies and you're sending it to all of your teammates and saving several versions on your computer. And then when you have a data page here, the original data, that you don't mess with that. What you do is you make a copy of that, and that's where you make your changes. And then you clean up the data, and once you get that cleaned up, that becomes your new original. And that's something which you never touch. So then you do all your analysis on copies of that. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But we talked about protecting the data. We talked about setting up the data, and then the question types. And now what we're going to do is we're going to have a video, or probably a couple or three even, on cleaning the data, and then just a little bit about finishing up. So what we looked at here was, this came from a questionnaire here on the Business Admin 111 Personal Data Survey. This is an example of a bad questionnaire, and we're not spending time going through correcting the questions. It's how to clean up the data that came from that. So here's the original 10 questions. And then what I did was I added some other ones here, because we talked about that there's different kinds of questions. So the first 10, as well as 11 and 12, are check one only type questions. And then we have 13, which is a branching question. 14, a check all that apply. 15 is how to deal with ranking questions. And then 16 is just an open-ended question. And so those are the questions that appear over here, and you can go back and take a look at the first video to find out more about how we set up the data set with those particular questions. But the other things to keep in mind here is that, remember, we have a block of data. We have contiguous columns, so no completely blank column here. We've got a contiguous set of rows, so no completely blank row here. And we've got labels at the top of each excuse me, of the columns here, and they represent the different variables or parts of questions. And then finally, what I said here was that you want to make sure that you've got a completely blank row and column around the outside of the table here. Now it looks like I've got something in this cell, but it's actually all in this particular cell here, and it just spills over. So there's actually nothing in this particular cell here. But what we've got here then is a nice block of data that looks like that, and you can see that there is nothing beside it and nothing below it. And we're going to continue cleaning up this particular data set. So let me just get back here the way it was. One of the things that I talked about near the end of that video here was just changing the labels at the top here to represent question numbers. So I'm just going to make those white here. As I go through later and clean up the data, all of the errors or things that I want you to focus in on, I'm going to make the changes, and then I'll make them white. I'll take off the yellow there. So let's continue on then with this. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, and we're taking a look here at the cleaning the data. So we talked about protecting the data. We talked about how to set up the data. And now we're going to take a look at question types. And now we're going to take a look at cleaning the data. So the first and most important thing, of course, is make a copy. Make a copy of this thing. Don't mess with your original data. Even the stuff that you have initially put in or typed in or came off of Google Forms or something, don't touch that data. Make a copy of it and then clean that data, that copy. So that's what we're talking about here, is working on that copy. I'm going to talk about some useful tools that you can use in cleaning the data here. And then in another video, we'll talk about common errors or issues. That might be 1 or 2 videos there. So let's take a look here then at some useful tools. And I want to look at the max, the min, the count A functions. We'll talk a little bit about sorting, pivot tables, the find feature, and average, median, standard deviations, and scatter plots there. So let's take a look at what we've got there on how that works. I'm going to take a look at our data here. Oops. There we go. All right, let's take a look at this. Now, I have made a copy of the original data. So the original data looked like this. And one thing that I mentioned here was to maybe color it all red so that you never touch this particular data. If you end up working on a page that has a bunch of red text, you know you're on the wrong place. That's the original data. So I made a copy of this and did some cleaning up of the data here. I've actually made another copy here. I'm going to continue working on this one here. So that's where we're at now. All right. Now, what I like to do is I'm going to add about 10 rows at the top here. So let's just do that. And just to remind you, I mean, you don't need to do this, but I'm going to color this particular row here, just above the data. I'm going to color it blue here. And that's just a reminder to me that, hey, you don't touch that row. Don't put anything in that particular row there, right? Because the data set has to be set apart from anything else. And I'm going to put in some useful functions here on that. So I'm going to put in the max function, and maybe I'll actually make this a little bit bigger here so you can see this. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to put in a max function and a min function, a count function, a count a function, and then there's a couple more that I'm going to put in a little bit later here. So let's specifically focus in on those ones right there. Now, what I like to do then is for each column, you're going to use a max function and just highlight all the way down here. So of course I'm not using the label, I'm just starting at the first respondent and all the way down here. By the way, I'm going to put in some dollar signs here, and just put the dollar signs in front of the numbers. Don't put it in front of the column letters. So in this particular case, then it says B $12 colon B $93. And the reason why I do that then is I can copy that function down, and I can just change the name of the function. Now, by the way, I'm doing this on Q1, the section, and so it's meaningless. There is no maximum for this, so that's why it says 0 here. And but I'm going to copy this down, and then I'm going to just edit this particular one here that says the max. I'm going to change it into the min. So I've got the max and the min, and then I'm going to do the count. So I'll change the word max to count. And then this will be really useful for these non-numerical ones. This will be a count A. And now we see something that's useful here. By the way, I'm just going to change these so that they're a little bit bigger. Maybe I'll take them up to about a 14 or something, just so you can see them a little better here. All right. So the count A function is useful because the A stands for, well, alphanumeric, or you can think of it as count anything that isn't a blank. So this tells us then that we have 82 people who have answered this particular question here. They put in their section number. And that's useful because we've got 82 respondents here. So everybody actually answered something. Now, what I do is I highlight these 4, and I'm just going to drag them all the way across. Oops, let's try that again. So just going to grab this little guy in the corner here and drag all the way across. And that's going to be really useful here because that's going to tell me some some of the common measures here that are useful for this. So for instance, when we take a look at this, what I want you to notice that the count is 82 for most of these as we go across here. In this particular case, it says 81. So for the pulse rate, it says 81, and that means that there's probably a blank down here. And there it is right there. All right. Now, that's not a problem with a data set typically, because that just simply means that the person didn't answer that question. When you come to doing some analysis where you're, say, comparing one variable versus another, let's say it's an ANOVA test or something, or a test of independence or something, then you will need to get rid of those blanks there. But it's a good idea just in terms of cleaning up the data to make sure that these numbers all make sense here. And so we go across here in terms of the counts, and we see, yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, the count and the count A for the numerical ones should be the same. If there's not, then that's a problem. So let me give you an example down here. Suppose I had actually the 78 here. I'm just going to put a little apostrophe in front of it. That actually makes it into text. And so you can see there's a little thing up in the corner here saying, whoa, there's something weird about this. But the count A is the one which is telling me that, hey, there's a bit of a problem here in terms of that, because the count is 80 numbers, but there's 81 filled cells here. So how do you do that? I'm just going to leave that one for now. In fact, let's color it yellow so we'll get back to that one. So we go across here, and those all look good as we go. Of course, the non-numerical ones have the 0 for a count, and that's fine, but it does tell us then how many cells are actually filled. Now, with a lot of these, you'll see that the numbers start to drop. And so when we get into this one here, this isn't a problem because these are other comments. So these are people who actually selected other for this particular question, and then they typed in a comment. So you'll see that there's 4 comments here, and that's not a problem, and so on. Some of these are very small as well, and that's because this is a check all that applied. And so you've got, for a particular row here, you've got this person checked off these 2 but left these 2 blank. So you would expect then these numbers then to be lower than 82. But of course the count A and the count should be the same in each case then. So this is interesting. Right here, I've got a 43 and a 47. And what is going on there? And if we go down here, we'll see, oh, there they are right there. Somebody put in X's. I'm going to get back to that one later, so I'm not going to correct it at this point. But that's where the count and the count A function come in very useful. All right, let's go back here and now take a look at the min and the max functions. So again, if we're talking about non-numerical variables, then they mean nothing because the min and the max are counting numerical values. And so we've got zeros, zeros. This is interesting here because this is talking about the heights. And so you've got, this is the heights in terms of inches. And this is goofy because you've got a min of 1.72, and then you've got 198 inches. That's a big person. So there's something really goofy there. And then as we go across here, we've got a min of 0. This is for a weight. So that's goofy. That doesn't work. And we also have a weight of 188. I think this one's actually in kilograms. I think that 198 is in centimeters, and this is in kilograms. So the 198 isn't actually that bad, but 188 kilograms is quite heavy. That's possible. This particular one here is pulse rate, and this is on a per minute basis. And so you've got a pulse rate of 18 Yeah, no, that doesn't work. And 800, that doesn't work either. So this is really useful for taking a look at the range of things and finding out you have any numbers which are really extreme here. It's also useful when you're dealing with things like rating scales and so on. And so I think number 9 and number 10 were 10-point rating scales. And so they should be numbers of 1 to 10 in this particular case then. So we're asked to just rate the TV ratings on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is terrible and 10 is great. And so we've got 1 to 16. So the 16 is a problem here. Similarly over here, no problem with the maximum for the movies, but you've got a rating here of 0. So that's a problem here. So the max and the min are going to be useful. Now, how can you find out where these problems are? Well, let's go back here then to, let's say, this one, the pulse rate. So we've got a low pulse rate here of 18, and we've got a max pulse rate of 1800. I'm going to show you how to use the sort function now. And the sort is a really useful tool for taking a look at the spread of the numbers, particularly the range, the high to the low there. One thing that I mentioned in setting up the data is that I like to take a row, like this one, row 8, and just color it all the way across. And there's nothing special about respondent number 8. It's just one of the rows that I chose here. I actually chose this because it doesn't have any yellow cells that are errors here. So that's why I chose that. But the reason why why I color a particular row here is when you sort the data, you always want to make sure that all of the columns sort together. So let's take a look here at the pulse rate. I can click on anywhere in the pulse rate column. Don't click at the column title, the column letter at the very top here, because if you do a sort here, Excel will say, hey, what are you doing? You're inside a data table here. Are you sure you want to sort just that particular column? And instead, what you do is you just click anywhere, any cell in the pulse rate column, and then we're going to go up here to data, and then we can just sort A to Z or Z to A, right? Ascending or descending. Boom, right off the bat, we see there's that 18, and so that's a problem. We're going to take a look at questionnaire number 10 and find out what did the person actually type. I'm going to get back to this particular problem later. 52 is actually fine as a beats per minute, and then we come down here and we've got 108's fine, but there's that 800, and there's that 78. That was the 78, which was the one which was put in as a label. So it goes right to the very bottom there. And so that's a nice place to find that. And so I'm going to fix that right now. I'm just going to go back in. I'm going to take off that little apostrophe before the 78. The apostrophe makes it into text. And now, if I resort that, you'll see it's no longer at the bottom. It's up here somewhere. There it is, right there. So I'll take off that shading now. So we've fixed that guy right there. So that's useful. And we can go through here and we can do that with similar kind of things here. So again, we had problems with the movie ratings and the TV ratings. So we could click anywhere in the TV ratings and do a sort. And we've got a low of 1, and then we've got that 16 right at the very bottom, which is for respondent number 12. So we can go in and we can find out what went wrong there. And so that is useful for all these kind of things. They're also useful, of course, for these kind of variables here, the nominal variables. So I could do a sort here according to the section. And what I'll see here is I've got all of the A's together, and then all of the B's. And then I've got, oh, there's a don't know. and then there's the E's, and then there's an F down here. I'm going to take a look at that particular problem again a little bit later. So the sort function is a very useful thing. Let me show you another one though. I'm just going to resort this back by respondent number. There we go. And notice, by the way, that in all those sortings here that this particular row stayed together. And so that's always a good thing to check is whenever you do a sort there. All right, now another useful tool here is a pivot table. And I use a pivot table a lot when I'm first cleaning up the data. So what I do is, as long as my data table is set up correctly, you know, the contiguous rows, contiguous columns, and nothing touching it on any side here. So I've got that, in that case, the blue rows and the blue column here that set it apart. So I've got that nice block of data. What I do is I click on any cell, and then I go into Insert a Pivot Table. And you don't need to do the pivot chart, which is over here. Just do the straight pivot table, like this. All right, and if you've set up your data correctly, you should see that there's a selection box around your data. That nice block there. Just simply press OK. It'll take you to a new sheet like that. And then what I do is I like to take the respondent number and click on that. Now, when you click on the respondent number, it should go into the bottom right here where it says the sum of the values. The problem is that we want to change this to a count, not a sum. And so the sum of the values is summing up the respondent numbers. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 all the way up to 82. That's why you get such a big number here of 3,403. And so what I do is over here, the bottom right, I'm just going to right click and choose the field settings and change that into a count. And now it should say that I've got 82 respondents. Now, you've probably seen the setup of pivot tables before when you're dealing with probability, or maybe in stats in Business 307 where you're talking about tests of independence. But you can actually just use this to clean the data. So for instance, let's take the section. And I'm going to grab the section, and I'm just going to pull it down here where it says the rows. And this is a really, really easy way of finding out what all the possible values are, or all the values that people have chosen and their numbers. So I should have section A, B, and E, which is what I've got here. I've got one who actually typed in don't know. And then I've got one here which is an F. That's kind of interesting. I wonder what happened there. So maybe the person who was typing this data in just typed in an F instead of an E, right? So that's a possibility here. I'm going to talk about that particular error a little bit later. So when I'm done with that, I can deselect it up here on the right-hand side. And I can just do that actually with every variable. I do it with every variable. So now I've got, gender should be dragged down here to gender. By the way, if you accidentally clicked on gender, you'll see that down on the right-hand side it says the count of the respondents and now the count of the genders. I can actually get rid of any of these by just clicking and just dragging it out, and it disappears. Okay, but this is useful. So now I've got here, I've got females, I've got males, I've got a neither, and I've got an A. So we'll take a look at that error a little bit later on as well. So let's get rid of the gender here. Let's go down to pulse rates. Actually, I won't do pulse rate. That's got a lot of different values there. I'll get to that a little bit later. The TV ratings and the movie ratings. So with the TV ratings, if I click on that one, so click, drag it down here, And so there I can see my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the 16. So there's the 116. So I should know that I need to look for that. The other interesting thing about this is if you take a look at movies, let's pull that one down, we've got a 6.5 in there. And that shouldn't be in there. So that's also something that we'll need to take a look at. As well as a 0, it was a 1 to 10 scale. So we've got 2 people who have a 0 down here. Now, that was probably the error of the person entering the data. And so that's something that we have to take a look at. So there's the 2 zeros, and then there's the 110. I've got those all highlighted, and we'll take a look at those again later. So that is really useful. I think we did have, remember we had those X's down there, and that was taking a look here at, which one was that for? Those were the ranking questions. So for instance, we had, let's get rid of the movies here. Just going to pull it off to the side here. Yeah, so in this particular one here, we have the respondent numbers, and it should say a 1, 2, a 3, and we've got actually the word second, so that should be changed to a 2, and we'll get back to that. You also have blanks here, and that's usually not a problem. I mean, we got 31 blanks, and that's not a problem for this type of question because this was ranking, and so they may not have ranked that particular item here. Where was the one with the X's? I think it was actually back in question number 14 here. So let's grab that and pull down that. And there's that X. Remember I showed you that X? So instead of putting in a 1, meaning that they checked it, somebody put in an X. So again, there's an error that you need to find. The last thing in terms of just using the pivot table here, let's deselect that. Let's go back to, say, pulse rate there. And if I pull that one down, the problem with this is that you're not getting a lot of, it's not helping you much beyond what you've got when you actually sort the thing, right? Because there's all possible different values here. But you can see this 18, and then you can quickly see the 52, 54, these all look good, and so on. This is a little more useful, of course, because it doesn't show you all 11 72s. But you can easily see there's the 800, so we'll have to find that particular guy, and the 18. All right, so that is how you use the pivot table to check your data here. Let's go back, and the next thing that I want to look at is the find feature. And so let's go back here to the clean data, the one that we were working on here. And what we noticed in here was that there was, back in pulse rate, actually let's look for that 6.5. That would be a better one here. So remember we said in the movie ratings there was a 6.5, which it shouldn't be in there. Now, when you've got 82 values, it's easy to scroll down here and see where the thing is. So I can scroll up like this, and it should jump out there fairly quickly. There it is right there. And of course, I've already highlighted it. But what happens if you have, say, 10,000 rows? If you do a sort, I mean, you can see the highs and you can see the lows. But if you do the pivot table and you find that there's some goofy value somewhere in there, the find feature is very useful. So what I can do is I can highlight this particular column here just to focus in there, and I'm going to go in here to the data. No, I'm going to go to the, oh, there we go. Go to home and go to find and select. And so I can do a find right here. And I'm going to look for that 6.5. Okay. And just choose find next. And there it is. It takes me right down there. So that's a really useful feature there, and particularly when you've got a very big data set, and so you've used a pivot table. And if you can't find that particular value very quickly, the find feature is something that is useful there on that. So that is the find feature. All right, now I think we've hit most of these things here in terms of cleaning the data. So we've talked about the max, the min, the count A functions, sorting, pivot table, define. I want to talk about the average, the median, the standard deviation, and the scatter plot. And so let's go back here, and I'm going to add in here then the average, actually, yeah, average, and the median, and the standard deviation, like that. Okay. And so again, what I can do here is I'm just going to copy that function down, paste, 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 and then change the word count A to to average, and then I'm going to change this to median, and then I'm going to change this to standard deviation. Now, one thing I want you to note here is that when you're dealing with non-numerical stuff, you end up with a problem because you're trying to remember an average. You divide through by the count, which in this case is 0, and so you end up with error messages. So when you're dealing with non-numerical stuff, nominal variables, then it doesn't work. But it sure does when you're dealing with the numerical variables. So interval scale variables in particular. Let's take a look at those here. So the reason why this is really useful here is that the average and the median, of course, are useful to tell you if the data are really skewed. And when I take a look at this, I go over to the pulse rate, and this really shows that I've got an average of 84 and a median of 72. So that would seem to indicate that I've got some really high values. Now we know what that high value is. It's 800, which is pulling it up. But just to note here then that this is useful for taking a look and also just getting a good feel for your data set here, is how the averages or the mean differs from the median. And if they're really different, then the data are skewed in some sort of way, and it could be because of errors, some really extreme outliers. In this particular case, remember we had a 1.72. By the way, that's actually 172 centimeters, and that was an error, and we'll get to that particular one here, but that's what's causing these differences here. All right. The standard deviation also is useful because it's showing you, remember, how spread out the data. And so when you've got a really high standard deviation here of 81 compared to a mean of just 83, then that's probably an indicator that you've got some really extreme values. And again, that's that 800 that you have there. So I like to do that. It also just gives me a good feel for my data and if I'm dealing with really skewed results or not. Let me also show you then how you can use a scatter plot to do this. So let's take a look at the pulse variable right here. And I'm just going to highlight all the way down here on that. So all the way down, I've highlighted this. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to insert a scatter plot. And you'll see that there's a number of different kinds of graphs here or charts here that you can use, and we're going to be using a scatter plot. So you'll find that as one of the common ones, a scatter plot. And this is really useful because, can you see that 800 now? That's that really shows you that outlier right there. And the other thing is it doesn't show this as well because, of course, all the rest of them are all around under 100 here or so, around 100. Here's that 18. But watch what happens here when I go and I get rid of that 800. So I'm just going to scroll down here until I find that 800. And there it is right there. And I'm going to change that to an 80 because that's probably what it is there. And when I do that, then take a look at the scatter plot over here on the side. You notice how that changes? And so we don't have that 800 anymore, but now I can see the 18. So that 18 there is really low. So it shows me the other outlier, the really small one. So that is a really useful thing for this. Let's try it with maybe one other variable here. I'm just going to go back and change that 800 because we're going to look at that again. All right, so let's delete that. And let's go over here to, I think it was the movie ratings. No, it was the TV ratings had that 16 there. So let's just take a look at that. So I'm just going to highlight this particular column here all the way down. All right, and then I'm going to go into Insert, and I'm going to choose a scatter plot. And right there, you can see that 16. And you can easily see that the other ones, they're supposed to be in a 1 to 10 scale, and you can see that they all are. So the lowest one is 1. There's no zeros there. And the highest one is, it looks like it's 9. There's no 10s. So if I found that 16 and got rid of it. So that's what I always do when I start with cleaning up the data. That helps me with those guys which are really extreme in particular. And with that, I think we're going to leave it there. The next thing that we'll take a look at is some of the common errors or issues that occur. So let's stop the video at this point, and we'll continue later. Thanks for listening.